In the winter of 1851, a county clerk in eastern Louisiana wrote a sentence in the margin of an estate ledger that was never meant to survive. The plantation belonged to a recently deceased sugar planter named Edgar Beauregard, a quiet man, deeply private, known for avoiding visitors and keeping his affairs tightly controlled. When the state ordered a full inventory of his property, the clerk did what clerks had always done. He listed acreage, buildings, livestock, equipment, and finally, the enslaved population. But while walking through the quarters, pen poised above paper, he hesitated. Not because of the numbers, not because of age or condition, but because of what he heard. Voices drifted through the damp air between the cabins, calm, confident, structured. Not the broken phrases he expected, not Creole, not fragments shaped by necessity. This was French. Not plantation French, not borrowed phrases. It was formal, flowing, precise French. French that sounded old. The clerk wrote a short note beside one entry, only one line. Several of the laborers converse fluently in French of an antiquated form. This observation is unusual. Within 10 days, that sentence was crossed out. Within 3 weeks, the page was rewritten. Within 2 months, the families connected to that note were gone. And for more than a century, no one asked why. The plantation stood far from the river, surrounded by cane fields and marshland that swallowed sound. Even by Louisiana standards, it was isolated. Roads flooded regularly, visitors were rare, outsiders stood out immediately. The clerk's name was Nathaniel Brooks. He was young, educated in New Orleans, and fluent in modern French himself. What he heard that day unsettled him deeply. He listened longer. A woman scolded her adult son using conditional verb forms Brooks had struggled to master in university. An elderly man told a story using idioms Brooks recognized only from old French texts, expressions that had fallen out of use before the French Revolution. This was not imitation. This was inheritance. According to every official record, these families had never left the plantation. Their parents had not. Their grandparents had not. No French overseers were documented, no tutors, no books, no visitors. Even Edgar Beauregard spoke only English. His letters proved it. When Brooks quietly asked one woman where she learned French, she did not answer directly. She paused. Then she said softly, "We learned the way children learn, from those who knew." She would say nothing more. What Brooks did not yet understand was that the discovery did not begin with Beauregard's death. It began decades earlier. And it began with a man who believed language could reshape the human mind. To understand what Nathaniel Brooks had stumbled upon, one had to go backward in time. Not to Edgar Beauregard, but to the man who owned the land before him. His name was Etienne Moreau. Moreau purchased the plantation in 1784, just after the American Revolution ended. He was not a planter by birth. He was a displaced merchant with ties to European shipping houses. A man who arrived with money, books, and ideas that unsettled his neighbors. He believed civilization was a habit, not a birthright. He believed language shaped the mind. And most dangerously, he believed that knowledge, once given, could not be reclaimed. Moreau kept extensive private journals, none of which survived him, but fragments of his thinking remained scattered through shipping records, legal filings, and the recollections of those who lived under his control. What those fragments suggest is something few at the time would have named openly. Moreau was running an experiment. In 1786, a French brigantine was driven ashore along the Gulf Coast during hurricane season. Most of those aboard drowned. A small number survived. Among them were two teachers, Julien Armand and Élise Fournier. They were provincial educators from France, fleeing political instability and seeking passage to the Caribbean. They never reached their destination. Stranded, undocumented, and vulnerable, they were taken in by Etienne Moreau. What he offered was shelter and protection. What he asked in return was education. Not for himself, not for his peers, for the people he enslaved. Moreau constructed a small building away from the main house. Officially, it was listed as storage. In practice, it became a school. 6 days a week, adults and children gathered inside. They were taught to speak, to read aloud, to sing, to reason, to remember. They were taught French as it was spoken in the late 18th century, grammar, literature, history, music. They were taught as if they were expected to one day walk freely into the world, and they learned as if their lives depended on it. Because, in a way, they did. In 1786, a French brigantine was driven ashore along the Gulf Coast during hurricane season. Most of those aboard drowned. A small number survived. Among them were two teachers, Julien Armand and Élise Fournier. They were provincial educators from France, fleeing political instability and seeking passage to the Caribbean. They never reached their destination. Stranded, undocumented, and vulnerable, they were taken in by Etienne Moreau. What he offered was shelter and protection. What he asked in return was education. Not for himself, not for his peers, for the people he enslaved. Moreau constructed a small building away from the main house. Officially, it was listed as storage. In practice, it became a school. 6 days a week, adults and children gathered inside. They were taught to speak, to read aloud, to sing, to reason, to remember. They were taught French as it was spoken in the late 18th century, grammar, literature, history, music. They were taught as if they were expected to one day walk freely into the world, and they learned as if their lives depended on it. Because, in a way, they did. Julien Armand and Élise Fournier did not see themselves as revolutionaries. They taught because teaching was who they were. At first, they believed their arrangement with Moreau was temporary. A season, perhaps two. Long enough for passage home to be arranged. But seasons passed, and the world beyond the plantation grew more unstable, not less. So they stayed. And the school continued. Children who had never held a book learned to recite poetry. Adults who had spent their lives in the fields discussed stories set in distant provinces they had never seen. Songs from rural France echoed through a place where they should never have existed. Language became more than instruction. It became shelter. It was spoken quietly at first, then confidently, then naturally. Within a few years, French was no longer a second language. It was the first. But what was being built could not remain invisible forever. In 1791, Julien Armand fell ill during the late summer heat. Fever took him within days. Elise continued teaching alone, but grief changed her. She began to speak openly about the immorality of the arrangement, about what it meant to educate people who remained legally owned, about how knowledge had been given without freedom to use it. She spoke of leaving. She spoke of telling authorities. Moreau could not allow that. What happened next was recorded only indirectly. Elise Fournier's death was ruled an accident, a fall. No investigation followed. She was buried quickly, without ceremony. Within weeks, the schoolhouse was emptied, books vanished, writing materials were destroyed. But the language remained. Mothers taught children, elders corrected pronunciation, stories replaced textbooks. Moreau, rather than suppressing the French, encouraged it quietly. He wanted to see whether knowledge could reproduce itself, whether culture, once planted, could survive in isolation. And for decades, it did. When Etienne Moreau died at the turn of the century, he left behind no public explanation for what he had done. His private papers were destroyed before the estate changed hands. The schoolhouse was reclassified as a storage shed. The French teachers were never mentioned in official documents. What remained was the knowledge itself. The plantation was eventually sold to Edgar Beauregard, a practical man with no interest in philosophy. He inherited families who spoke French among themselves and English only when necessary. At first, he ignored it. Then he noticed the precision, the consistency, the way children corrected one another when pronunciation drifted. Beauregard understood enough to recognize danger. Educated enslaved people frightened buyers, frightened neighbors, frightened authorities. So he made a choice. He did not stop the language. He hid it. For decades, an uneasy balance held. French was spoken only in the quarters, never near visitors, never near the main house. Children were warned. Adults were careful. The language became a private inheritance, guarded more fiercely than possessions. Generations passed. By the time Beauregard died in 1851, 3 generations had spoken 18th-century French without ever leaving the plantation. Then came the inventory. Then came Nathaniel Brooks. And then came the mistake that made silence impossible. Brooks heard what he should not have heard. He wrote what should not have been written. And once the words existed on paper, even briefly, they could not be unseen. The secret that had survived half a century now stood exposed. Not to scholars, but to the state. When the parish magistrate read Nathaniel Brooks's inventory, he understood the problem immediately. This was not a curiosity. It was a threat. An enslaved population fluent in formal French suggested literacy. Literacy suggested independent thought. Independent thought suggested instability. The magistrate summoned Brooks to the courthouse. He spoke calmly, almost kindly. He reminded Brooks that estate inventories were legal instruments, not academic records. Their purpose was to establish value, not raise questions. French-speaking laborers, he explained, would alarm buyers. Educated slaves were considered difficult, dangerous, unsellable at fair price. The solution was simple. The notation would be removed, the ledger would be rewritten, and the matter would go no further. Brooks nodded. He signed the revised page. Outwardly, He complied. Privately, Brooks began to write everything down. Not in the ledger, in a separate journal. He recorded names, ages, family lines. He wrote down phrases he heard, songs, idioms, grammatical constructions he recognized from old French texts. He understood that what he was documenting was not just language. It was proof. Proof that education had existed where it was forbidden. Proof that culture had survived without permission. While Brooks wrote in secret, the state acted openly. The Beauregard estate was ordered liquidated quickly. Buyers were encouraged to come from multiple parishes. Families were not grouped. Children were not kept with parents. The dispersal was deliberate. A community that spoke together was dangerous. Individuals scattered across plantations were not. The auction took place on a cold morning. Men arrived on horseback and in wagons, carrying ledgers and quiet expectations. They inspected bodies the way they inspected tools, asking about strength, health, temperament. Language was not supposed to matter, but it did. Nathaniel Brooks stood at the edge of the crowd as names were called. Families stepped forward together at first, then were separated without ceremony. A mother was sold to a cotton grower upriver. Her daughter went to a rice plantation miles away. Her grandchildren were divided between two buyers who did not know or care that they shared a language no one else around them would understand. The French did not stop that day, but it weakened. A sentence left unfinished. A correction swallowed. A child silenced before a word could form. Before one elderly woman was led away, Brooks managed to speak with her briefly. She had been a child when the first lessons began, old enough to remember the teachers, old enough to remember the sound of books opening. Brooks apologized. She looked at him steadily and answered in French, her voice calm, precise, unchanged by age or fear. What is learned cannot be owned. What is remembered cannot be taken. Then she turned and walked away. Brooks never saw her again. Within weeks, the plantation was emptied of its past. New laborers arrived. New routines replaced old ones. The quarters fell silent of anything unusual. The language, once shared, now existed only in fragments carried away by scattered individuals. And fragments without community do not last. After the auction, the story began to disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly. The ledger entries were finalized. The revised pages were filed. No mention of language appeared anywhere in the official record. To anyone reading later, the Beauregard estate looked ordinary, unremarkable. Nathaniel Brooks returned to his clerical duties. Outwardly, his life continued unchanged. Inwardly, he understood what he had witnessed would not survive unless someone chose to remember it. So he kept writing. At night, by lamplight, he added to his private journal. He reconstructed conversations from memory. He described accents, sentence structures, the way elders corrected children gently. Years passed. The families who had been sold carried what they could. In some places, the French survived for a few more years. In others, it vanished almost immediately, replaced by the language necessary for survival. A grandmother whispered lullabies no one else understood. A man counted quietly to himself in a language his children never learned. A prayer survived, written phonetically in the margin of a Bible, its meaning forgotten, even as the sounds remained. By the 1870s, the French existed mostly as rumor. By the 1890s, it was dismissed as exaggeration. Brooks died in 1889. His journal was packed away by relatives who never opened it, labeled simply as personal papers, and placed into storage. The language had vanished. The proof of its existence waited in silence. Nearly 80 years after Nathaniel Brooks wrote his last entry, a graduate student sorting through courthouse donations opened a small, leather-bound journal. It was unremarkable at first. Personal notes, observations, dates. Then she noticed the French. Not modern French, not classroom French. Old French. 18th century French. The phrases were precise, grammatically intact, regionally consistent. They matched linguistic forms that should not have existed in 19th century rural Louisiana, let alone among people who had never traveled, never been educated, never been allowed access to books. As archivists cross-referenced the names in the journal, a pattern emerged. Auction records, estate inventories, parish sales. They aligned perfectly. What had been erased from the ledger had survived in private memory. The findings were published quietly. There were no headlines, no public debate, no memorial. By then, the world had moved on to other struggles, other injustices, other histories demanding attention. The land where the schoolhouse once stood had changed hands many times. Roads crossed it. Buildings replaced fields. No marker remained. The language itself was gone. But the truth it revealed was not. For 3 generations, people who were never meant to learn proved that knowledge could survive captivity, that culture could be preserved without permission, that intelligence had never been absent, only denied. The story was not erased because it was false. It was erased because it was undeniable. Some truths are buried not by time, but by choice. And when that happens, silence does not mean absence. It means someone, somewhere, decided the world was not ready to know.